My daughter-in-law sent me a text on a Tuesday afternoon that said, "We've already made our plans for Thanksgiving. You're not part of them. Please stop inserting yourself into our family." My son read it. He said nothing. Not one word. So that evening, I sat down at my kitchen table in my housecoat and I did something I never imagined doing. I logged into my online banking, found every automatic transfer I'd set up over the past 4 years, and I canceled every single one of them. 3 days later, my son was at my front door, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Margaret, and I've lived in the same house in Oakville, Ontario for 31 years. The house where my husband Robert and I raised our son Daniel from the time he was 4 years old, right through university, right through his wedding, right through everything. Robert died 5 years ago this past March. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the day I held his hand for the last time in a hospice bed that smelled like antiseptic and fresh linen. 6 weeks. He was 63. I'm 66 now. I work 3 mornings a week at the public library helping with the seniors' digital literacy program, which I find equal parts exhausting and deeply satisfying. I have a small circle of friends, a garden I'm genuinely proud of, and a cat named Biscuit, who has the personality of a disappointed accountant. I have a son who lives 40 minutes away in Mississauga with his wife Renee and their 2 children, my grandchildren Sophie, who is 9, and Luke, who is 6. And for 4 years, I have been quietly, steadily, financially hollowing myself out to keep them comfortable, to keep them close, to keep them from drifting so far away that I lost them too, the way I lost Robert. That's the part I need you to understand first. Because this isn't a story about ungrateful children, not exactly. It's a story about a woman who was so terrified of being alone that she taught the people she loved how to take advantage of her. And then one Tuesday in October, she finally stalked. It started the autumn. Robert died. Daniel called me in April, 6 weeks after the funeral. He sounded tired and a little sheepish, the way he used to sound as a teenager when he needed something. "Mom," he said, "Renee's mat leave ends in September, and the daycare wait list is brutal. We found a spot, but it's $1,200 a month per child. We're stretched pretty thin right now." I said yes before he finished the sentence. "Of course, don't worry about it. I'll transfer you tonight," he said, "just until things even out." I said, "I know, sweetheart. Don't even think about it." Things did not even out. By the following spring, the daycare payments had become automatic. I set up a recurring transfer every first of the month because I could see it stressing him out to ask, and I couldn't stand to watch him stressed. When their furnace broke in February, I transferred $4,000 the same day Daniel texted me. When Renee wanted to redo their kitchen and she framed it as a safety issue, something about the counters being a hazard around the children, which I still to this day do not entirely believe, I put in $8,000. When Daniel's company downsized and he was between contracts for 3 months, I covered their mortgage payments, $4,100 a month, for 3 months. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Robert would have done the same. Would he, though? I hear his voice sometimes when the house is quiet. Not in a supernatural way, just the way you hear someone after 35 years of marriage. The cadence of how he talked, the specific phrases he used. He used to say, "Maggie, you can love someone and still make them figure it out." I nodded along when he said it. I thought I agreed. By the time of that October text from Renee, I had given Daniel and his family, by my later accounting, $162,000 in 4 years. Not loans, transfers. Money from Robert's life insurance, from my RRSP, from the TFSA we'd spent years building together. $162,000 and a Thanksgiving invitation declined by text message. I need to back up a little further, though, to a Sunday dinner in September. The last time I saw them before everything collapsed. I had driven to their place in Mississauga because Renee didn't like bringing the kids to my house, something about the drive being hard on Luke's ears. I brought a roast chicken, 2 side dishes, a pie from the bakery near my house that I know Sophie loves. I got there at 2. By 2:15, Renee was on her phone at the counter while I tried to occupy the children, who were also on devices. Daniel was watching football in the living room. He gave me a one-armed hug when I arrived and then disappeared. We sat down to eat at 4. By that point, the chicken was cold, and I had quietly reheated it twice. Nobody noticed, or nobody said anything. Renee spent most of dinner telling Daniel about a renovation she wanted to do in the basement. Daniel nodded. Sophie kept climbing down from her chair. Luce fell asleep before dessert, just toppled sideways in his booster seat, and nobody laughed at how sweet it was. Nobody pointed it out. Everyone just kept talking about the basement. At 6, Renee started clearing plates and said to Daniel, loud enough for me to hear, we should get them in the bath. I was still there. I was right there at the table with half a cup of tea. Daniel looked at me, a little apologetic. You okay to head out, Mom? Early morning tomorrow. I drove home on the QEW in the dark, and I cried the whole way. Not sobbing, just the silent kind, where the tears run down your face and you don't bother wiping them because there's no point. 3 weeks later, the Thanksgiving text. I want to be precise about what it said because I have read it so many times I could recite it without looking. We've already made our plans for Thanksgiving. You're not part of them. Please stop inserting yourself into our family. I had not asked about Thanksgiving. I had sent a text earlier that week asking if Sophie's fall soccer schedule was posted yet because I wanted to come watch a game. That was the insertion Renee was referring to, wanting to watch my granddaughter play soccer. I texted Daniel. Did you see what Renee sent me? He replied 40 minutes later. Mom, she's just stressed. Maybe give her some space for a bit. Give her some space. I had given her $8,000 for a kitchen I was not allowed to eat in comfortably, and my son was asking me to give her space. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark in the bed that still felt too wide after 5 years, and I thought about Robert, about something he'd said the last week of his life, when he was still lucid enough to have real conversations. We were sitting by the window in his room, and he took my hand and said, Maggie, when I'm gone, don't you dare disappear into their lives just to stay close to them. You have a life. Live it. Promise me. I had promised. And then I'd done the exact opposite. At 1 a.m, I got up, made tea, and opened my laptop. I pulled up my online banking and I started going back through 4 years of transfers. I made a spreadsheet. Robert taught me how. Years ago, when we were planning for retirement, I put in every amount I could document, every e-transfer, every time I paid something directly. The daycare costs alone, the furnace, the kitchen, the 3 months of mortgage coverage, the respot contributions I'd made for Sophie and Luke that technically went to them for the children, but still, birthday gifts, Christmas gifts, the new stroller when Luke was born, the trip to Florida they took 2 years ago that Daniel said they couldn't afford, and somehow I ended up contributing $3,000 to. The final number made me sit back so hard my chair scraped the floor. $162,400. in 4 years. From money Robert spent his whole working life building for our retirement, money he left me with specific instructions to protect. I sat in my kitchen until the sun came up. Biscuit jumped into my lap at some point and I didn't even move him. I just sat there with this number in front of me and I thought about what Robert had said, about disappearing into their lives, about living mine, about the promise I'd broken. At 7 in the morning, I opened the banking app on my phone and I canceled the automatic transfer I had running to Daniel's account. $800 a month. No specific purpose attached to it, just a number that had started as help with the daycare and then kept going long after the kids were in school. Canceled. Then I found the secondary transfer I'd set up when Daniel was between contracts. He'd asked me to keep it running in case things got tight again. $500 a month, sitting there on the first of every month like an allowance. Canceled. Then I put the phone face down on the table and I made more tea and I sat with the silence. I texted Daniel that afternoon, one word, no. He'd sent a follow-up message after the Renee text, something about hoping I understood they needed their space as a family. I had been drafting responses for 2 days. Explanations. Apologies. Gentle pushback that wouldn't push too hard. In the end, just no. He called me 6 times that evening. I didn't answer. The next morning, 7 more times. On the 8th call, I picked up. Mom. His voice had that edge I recognized from when he was 17 and hadn't gotten what he wanted. What's going on? The transfer didn't go through. I know. Is something wrong with your account? No, Daniel. I canceled it. Silence. Long enough that I checked if the call had dropped. You canceled it. Why? Because your wife sent me a text telling me I was inserting myself into your family. So I've decided to stop inserting myself financially as well. Mom, she was having a hard week. You know how she gets. I do know how she gets. I've known for 4 years, and I kept sending the money anyway. I think I'm done with that. He came to my house the following afternoon. He didn't knock the way I'd taught him to knock. The way he knocked as a child, that little double tap that was his own. He knocked the way you knock on a door when you're already irritated with whatever's on the other side. Hard and flat. I let him in. He sat on the couch in my living room, the same couch he'd grown up with, and he looked around my house like he was noticing it for the first time in years. Which, honestly, he probably was. Mom, he said, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this isn't how we handle things in our family. Our family, I said. That's interesting. He stared at me. Your wife told me I was not part of your plans and to stop inserting myself. And you told me to give her space. So I've given you space. And I've given myself some clarity. I had my laptop open on the coffee table. I turned it toward him. Do you know how much I've given you in the past 4 years? He looked at the screen. His face did something complicated. Mom, we've been going through a lot. $162,000, Daniel, since your father died. From his life insurance. From money we saved together for 30 years so I'd be okay when I was old. He was quiet. The daycare, I said. The furnace. The kitchen renovation. 3 months of mortgage payments. The Florida trip. Birthday parties. Christmas. The money I've been sending just because you asked. All of it. His jaw tightened. So this is about money. This is about the fact that your wife told me I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving and you said nothing. And I realized that for 4 years I have been paying for a relationship that has been shrinking anyway. He opened his mouth, closed it. "When was the last time you called me just to talk?" I asked him. Not to ask for something. Not to tell me Renee was stressed and needed space. Just to ask how I was doing. He didn't answer, which was, in its way, an answer. He left 40 minutes later, not slamming the door, but close. I stood in my hallway and listened to his car back out of the driveway, and I thought, good. Which surprised me. I expected to feel grief or doubt or the familiar spiral of what have I done. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, like I'd been holding my breath and finally breathed out. What I didn't expect was what happened 2 weeks later. I was at the library for my Tuesday shift when my phone buzzed. A voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. I listened to it in the parking lot after my shift, sitting in my car with the heat running. It was a woman named Cynthia. She identified herself as a financial advisor at a law firm in Burlington. She said she'd been contacted by my son and his wife regarding concerns about my financial decision-making capacity. She said she'd been asked to provide information about power of attorney applications and that she wanted to make sure I was aware of what was being discussed. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. They were trying to take control of my finances, not in a violent or obvious way, in the careful, procedural, Canadian way of it. Forms and lawyers and concerns about capacity. Daniel had apparently told this woman that I had been acting erratically, that I'd made a large impulsive financial decision that suggested I wasn't managing well on my own since Robert died. I called my own lawyer the next morning. She has been my lawyer for 12 years, since before Robert got sick. I told her everything. When I was done, there was a long pause, and then she said, "Margaret, I'm glad you called me before they got any further. What they're describing isn't guardianship exactly, but it's moving in that direction. If they file a capacity assessment application, you'd need to be evaluated. We need to get ahead of this." A capacity assessment. Because I had stopped sending my son money, she was brisk and efficient in the way I have always appreciated. She told me to document everything, every text, every call, the voicemail from the financial advisor, the Renee message, all of it. She told me that given my health, I take medication for blood pressure and I had a minor knee surgery 2 years ago, nothing serious. And my age, the concern would be that I appeared vulnerable. She used the word vulnerable the same way you use a word that has a clinical meaning separate from what it sounds like. I am not vulnerable. I am 66 years old and I run a digital literacy program for seniors and I do not need my son to manage my money. She also recommended I call my family doctor to have a general cognitive assessment on record just in the event this escalated. Not because there was any concern, because documentation is its own kind of protection. My doctor is a brisk, funny woman named Dr. Protection. Okafor, who I'd been seeing for 9 years. She did the assessment the following week. Afterwards, she took off her glasses and said, "Margaret, your recall is excellent. Your executive function is completely intact. And frankly, I'd like you to come do the digital literacy sessions for my older patients, because some of them need it desperately. There is nothing wrong with you. Is someone suggesting otherwise?" I told her the situation. She wrote a full letter for my file and a copy for my lawyer. The next phone call from Daniel came 3 days later. I picked up this time. "Mom, I think we need to talk about what's happening with your finances." His voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. Measured. I could tell someone had coached him on what to say. "I think you should be talking to your own finances," I said. "I'm told you've been consulting with a financial advisor on my behalf." Dead silence. "I have a very good lawyer, Daniel. and a letter from my doctor, and a spreadsheet that documents every dollar I've sent you since your father died. If you'd like to have a conversation about who needs help managing their money, I'm happy to have it." He hung up. Renee called 20 minutes later. She has never, in the 11 years she has been my daughter-in-law, called me directly unless Daniel was unavailable. Her voice was smooth in a way that put me on alert immediately. "Margaret, I just want to say I know things have been tense, and I think there's been some miscommunication." "Miscommunication," I said. "I never meant for my text to come across the way it did. I've been struggling with some things, and I took it out on you, and that wasn't fair." She had clearly also been coached. By Daniel, I imagined, once his own approach had failed. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I accept your apology." A pause. She wasn't expecting that to land so flat. "So maybe we can talk about getting things back to normal? Daniel's been really stressed. I understand he has. I've noticed that the financial pressure seems to cause him a great deal of stress. Hopefully now that I'm not in a position to continue the transfers, he'll find other ways to manage it." Another pause. "Longer this time. I'd like to keep having a relationship with Sophie and Luke," I said. "I'd like that to continue regardless of whatever else is happening. But I think you and I both know what the last few years have looked like, and I don't think going back to normal is actually what either of us needs." She hung up without saying goodbye. Here is what I did not expect. My sister-in-law calling me 3 days later to tell me she'd heard I was having a hard time coping. Here is what I also did not expect. My oldest friend Patricia, who I have known since our children were in nursery school together, calling to say Daniel had reached out to her, that he was worried about me. I had been outflanked. Renee and Daniel had spent a week on the phone building a narrative about a grief-stricken widow making impulsive financial decisions, and I was only now catching up. I called my sister Janet in Halifax. We speak every Sunday. She knew parts of this story, but not all of it. I told her everything. The money, the October text, the capacity assessment threat, all of it. When I finished, Janet was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Maggie, why didn't you tell me any of this earlier?" I said, "Because I was ashamed, because I knew what you'd say, because I didn't want to admit that my own son was letting this happen." She didn't say, "I told you so." She just said, "What do you need from me right now?" And I started crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the whole thing started. The kind of crying that comes from relief more than grief, from being known. I'll tell you something. In the weeks that followed, the people who knew the whole story stood in my corner without hesitation. Patricia, once she understood, called me and said she owed me an apology for even taking Daniel's call at face value. My sister-in-law came around. Even Robert's brother, who I was never particularly close to, sent me a card that said simply, "Robert would be furious. You did the right thing." And the ones who didn't come around, one of Daniel's cousins who'd always been closer to him than to me, a neighbor who knew Renee from a parent group. I let them have their opinions. I had spent 4 years managing other people's feelings at the expense of my own. I was done with that particular hobby. The capacity assessment application never came. My lawyer had sent a letter to the firm Renee had contacted, attaching Dr. Okafor's assessment and a politely worded but unmistakably firm note about the consequences of proceeding without grounds. We did not hear from them again. I started talking to a counselor named Diane who works out of a practice in Burlington. I want to be clear that I did not need grief counseling in the way people imagine, not the raw-wound kind. What I needed was someone to help me understand why I had kept transferring money to my son long after I knew on some level what was happening, what I was paying for. Diane is the kind of person who asks questions slowly and then waits, genuinely waits for the answer. She said to me in our third session, "Margaret, what did the money mean to you?" And I thought about it for a long time, and then I said, it meant I was still his mother. It meant he still needed me. And after Robert, I couldn't stand the idea of not being needed. Diane nodded and said, "And what did it cost you?" We were quiet together for a while. The thing about stopping is that it doesn't end the story. It starts a different one. Spring arrived, which in Ontario comes with a particular defiant brightness, like it knows how long you've been waiting. I went back to my garden. I planted what I plant every year: tomatoes, dahlias, the herbs Robert always wanted near the back door, even though neither of us used them very much: sage and rosemary and thyme. It felt like a form of continuity I could manage. I saw Sophie and Luce twice in April, once at a public skating event that Renee attended but barely acknowledged me, and once when Daniel dropped them at my house for a Saturday afternoon while he and Renee did something I wasn't told about. Both times Sophie ran to me the way she always has, with that full-body enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who doesn't yet know how to hedge her affections. I held her and Luke in my front hall and breathed them in and thought, This is what I was so afraid of losing. And it was still here. It had never actually been threatened. It had just been used as leverage. Daniel and I did not speak for 6 weeks. The silence was uncomfortable and strange in the way that silences are when you've known someone their whole life. He was not a bad person. He had never been a bad person. He had been a man who found it easier to let his mother pay for things than to figure them out himself, and he had been married for 11 years to a woman who was very good at identifying when someone could be relied upon to solve a problem. Neither of those things made him bad. They made him something I had contributed to. Diane and I talked about that a lot. When he finally called, it was a Sunday evening in May. He asked if he could come over. I said yes. He sat in the same spot on the same couch, but this time he knocked the right way first. He said, "I owe you an apology. I've been sitting with this for weeks trying to figure out how to say it properly, and I think there isn't a proper way. I just have to say it. I let you down. Not just recently. For years. I let you keep giving us money because it was easy, and I told myself you could afford it and that you wanted to help, which was true. Both of those things were true, but they weren't the whole truth. The whole truth is, I stopped asking if it was okay because I was afraid you'd say no, because I needed you to say yes. And that's not how I want to be with you." I looked at my son. He's 41 now. He has Robert's forehead and my stubbornness, and when he is being honest, a kind of directness that I have always loved in him. I said, "I need you to understand what I gave up. Not to punish you, just so you understand. $162,000 was a significant portion of what your father and I saved for my retirement. I'm not destitute. I'm fine. But I'm not as fine as I should be. And some of that is on you, and some of it is on me for not saying no." He nodded. I said, "I'm not going to be that person again. I want a relationship with you and with your children that doesn't have money in the middle of it. If something happens and you genuinely need help, we can talk about it like adults. But the automatic transfers are gone, and they're staying gone." He said, "I know. I'm not here to ask for money." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "Okay. Do you want to stay for dinner?" He stayed for dinner. He stayed for dinner. We talked for 3 hours. about Robert, which we had not done together in a long time, about his work, which was going better, about Sophie's reading and Luke's new obsession with building things out of cardboard. At one point, he said something that made me laugh, really laugh, and I realized it had been a long time since I'd laughed in this house with another person. Biscuit came out from wherever he'd been sulking and sat on Daniel's feet, which is the cat equivalent of a significant gesture. Renee is a more complicated story, and I won't pretend otherwise. She and I are not close. I don't know if we ever will be. But she has been, since everything came to a head, notably different in the ways that matter. She hasn't sent me a text like the October one. She hasn't gone cold. She brings the children to my house now, occasionally, something she hadn't done in over a year. We talk at the door for a few minutes in the polite, slightly careful way of two people who know what they know about each other and are choosing, for the sake of something larger, to proceed anyway. It is not warmth, but it is not hostility either. I'll take it for now. There's something Robert used to say about forgiveness. He said it's not the same as forgetting, and it's not the same as trust. He said forgiveness is just deciding not to carry the weight of it anymore. You put it down. You don't have to pretend it was never there. I've been putting things down this year. The fear that said I had to buy love to keep it. The habit of making myself small to avoid conflict. The guilt that arrived every time I chose something for myself. I put those down like bags I've been carrying since March 5 years ago when I watched my husband die in a room that smelled like antiseptic and fresh linen. And I was so terrified of being alone that I made my whole self into a reason for people to stay. I am still in the house in Oakville. The garden did well this summer, the dahlias especially. I've been volunteering an extra morning at the library, which the woman who runs the program pretends to complain about, but clearly doesn't mind. I have dinner with Janet when she comes to visit, which is more often now. I've started a watercolor class on Thursday evenings because a woman named Barbara from the library program invited me and I said yes instead of no, which is the newer version of me. My TFSA is being rebuilt. Slowly, responsibly, the way Robert would want. I have a new will that puts the bulk of my estate into a trust for Sophie and Luke's, accessible when they're each 25. Daniel and Renee know about it. Neither of them argued. I think that, more than anything, told me something had genuinely shifted. On a Friday evening in September, Daniel dropped off the children for a sleepover. It was Sophie's idea. She'd asked him, apparently, and he'd said yes without prompting, which used to not be how it went. We made pasta from scratch because Sophie decided we were going to flour and eggs on my kitchen counter, both of us in aprons, Luke mostly watching and occasionally adding ingredients we hadn't asked for. We ate too late and watched a movie, and they fell asleep on the couch pull out in the living room, and I sat in my chair with my tea, and I looked at their faces in the blue flicker of the television, and I thought about what it cost to get here. $162,000. One text message that said stop inserting yourself. One night sitting with a spreadsheet at 1 a.m, finally doing the arithmetic I had been afraid to do for years. One very hard phone call to a lawyer. One promise to a man who knew me better than I knew myself, who said, "Maggie, you have a life. Live it." I looked at my grandchildren sleeping. I looked around my house, my garden visible through the window. Biscuit a gray lump at the foot of their pullout. I thought about Robert's voice, the cadence of it, the specific way he said my name when he meant it most. Untrying, I said out loud to no one, and for the first time in a very long time, I believed myself. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles in a house after something irreversible has happened. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of a decision finally made. I sat in my kitchen the morning after I canceled those transfers, and I noticed that quiet, and I noticed I wasn't afraid of it. I've thought a lot about what it actually took to get to that moment. Not just the October text from Renee, not just the spreadsheet, not just the lawyer and Dr. Okafor and the voicemail from a financial advisor I'd never met. It took all of that, yes. But underneath all of that was something simpler and harder. I had to be honest with myself about what I had been doing and why. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell a story like this one. The person who got taken advantage of. And I was taken advantage of. I don't have any trouble saying that now. That person usually had a hand in building the situation, not because they were foolish, because they were human. I was so afraid of losing Daniel after I lost Robert that I made myself useful in the only way that felt guaranteed to work. Money is transactional. It shows up when it's supposed to. It doesn't get tired or distracted or decide it needs space. I substituted financial reliability for the kind of closeness I actually needed. And I kept doing it long past the point where any reasonable part of me knew it wasn't working. That's not weakness, but it's not wisdom either. The honest truth is that wisdom, the real kind, not the kind you find in a card at a gift shop, requires you to sit with uncomfortable information without immediately making it go away. Every time I opened my banking app to send another transfer, I was making the discomfort go away. Every time I didn't say what I actually felt at that dinner table in Mississauga, I was making the discomfort go away. I was intelligent enough to see what was happening. I just kept choosing not to look directly at it. Those are two different things. What changed in October wasn't that I suddenly became smarter. It was that the discomfort got loud enough that I couldn't talk over it anymore. Renee's text was not subtle, and in that lack of subtlety, it gave me something I'd been avoiding for 4 years. A clear enough picture that I couldn't make it into something else. What I did with that picture, that took something different. That took the part of me that Robert had always trusted more than I did. He used to say I was tougher than I gave myself credit for. I thought he was just being kind. But getting through those weeks, the lawyer, the capacity assessment threat, the phone calls from people who'd heard Daniel's version of events, the long silence before he finally came back with something real to say, that required a steadiness I didn't know I had until I needed it. You find out what you're made of in the spaces where no one is going to rescue you. Daniel and I are not all the way back. I don't think we ever go fully back to anything, but we're building something that doesn't have a transaction at the center of it, and that feels more solid than anything we had before, even when it's harder. Sophie made pasta with me last September with flour on her nose and complete confidence that she was in charge of the whole operation. Luke kept trying to add things we hadn't asked for. I laughed until my eyes watered. That evening cost me nothing except flour and time, and it was worth more than any of the $162,000 ever was. I think that's the thing I want to hold on to. Not as a lesson, not as a conclusion, just as something true that I now know in my body the way you know things that have actually happened to you. The real stuff doesn't get purchased. It gets built, slowly, by people who keep showing up for each other when there's nothing in it for them. That's what I'm trying to be now. A person who shows up. For my grandchildren, for my sister, for the people at the library who need someone patient with a mouse and a keyboard. For myself. Especially for myself. Robert would probably say, finally, Maggie. He'd be right.